Morning. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. I'm overwhelmed. I'm going to talk today about the history of Arabic script printing in the world. The history of printing is deeply rooted in antiquity in the Middle East and the East, primarily with seals, printing of signet rings and seals, which were not used with wax normally because of the heat, which would melt the wax, but with ink. So there would be an intaglio impression on a ring. You'd make your seal, sometimes to seal cargo, and this was more safe than locks because you can't forge a seal really. And then later on with signet rings, you see impressions on manuscripts and other things. And everybody had them. Even Lane in the 1800s was talking about the Egyptians all having signet rings and described their use. You put some ink on the ring and then moisten the paper and make your impression. We have here a lovely, it's not early, it's 18th century, but a genealogical seal, not a ring, but a lozenge on brass, which has a lineage of a certain Shah Nur-ad-Din going back to the Prophet Muhammad, and he would have used that for his documents and official registers and things. We have a plethora of riches in this regard, and I'm conscious I only have 10 minutes, but one area where we may be a little bit poor is 10th to 15th century block prints, which were only really discovered in the 19th century in Fayoum, which is an oasis city near Cairo, well, 100 kilometers from Cairo. We discovered these block prints, which are mainly amuletic in nature, quotes from the Qur'an and things like that, which were carved in wood and printed on paper usually, and more have turned up in libraries across Europe and the US. This one is a photocopy of one, which is in the other place. We're hoping one will turn up in our collection sometime, because the Bodleian gives up its secrets quite not easily. So what about the first printed book in Arabic? Well, that happened in 1514 not in the Middle East, but in Italy. And a certain Venetian called Gregorius de Gregorii got a proclamation from the Pope and permission from the Pope to print a book of hours for export to Eastern Christians in the Levant, Lebanon, Syria. And this was a preoccupation of the Catholic Church as a counter-Reformation tactic, and also to its ongoing propagation to Eastern Christians, like not the Maronites, because they always kept with Rome, but the Syrian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox Melkites and Nestorians there. This was owned by Archbishop Laud, so he must have got it quite early on. It was printed in Fano, which is a provincial city in Italy, and it wasn't a success. Because calligraphy is the supreme art in the Middle East, if anything doesn't look aesthetically pleasing, it will be rejected, and this was pretty much wholesale rejected and wasn't a success. However, the church later on founded the Maronite College in the 1580s, and the Maronites came over from Lebanon and translated books, learned European languages, and helped the Catholic Church with their propagation. And in the 1580s, the Medici press was set up. Again, Cardinal Ferdinand Medici was the head of it, and John Battista Raimondi was the chief architect of the Medici press. He employed the famous French type designer Robertus Gragnon. You may have heard of him as his classical typefaces, but he designed some Arabic typefaces. He was paid a very good stipend to do so. And here we have a copy of Avicenna's Canon, which is the medicinal text, which was prevalent in European and Islamic universities until the 18th century, maybe. You can see Gragnon's three typefaces, the large, medium, and small there. And this was a success. Books from the Medici press by the orders of Sultan of Ottoman Turkey were exported to Turkey, even though they didn't print themselves at that time. They were interested in printed books, but feared errors creeping into texts, which were widely disseminated by printing. This is interesting as well because it contains an extra book by Avicenna on logic, physics, and metaphysics. And at the end of the book, there are some asterisks where the Catholic Church didn't agree with Avicenna's views, but they allow them to be printed, and there's a statement saying we allow it to be printed because it benefits students of Arabic. They're mainly to do with prophethood and things like that. Not very many things that weren't agreed with. So I feel that's quite lenient on the part of the Catholic Church, which has a reputation for excising books and things. What about the first books printed in the Middle East? Well, in 1610 there was a copy of the Psalms printed, but not in Arabic type. It was Arabic in Karshuni, so Syriac type, and it wasn't until 1704 that Abdullah Zakir printed a copy of the Psalms in Syria, and then he opened a press at the Monastery of St. John in Choueir in Lebanon. And this is this is the third printing of the Psalms by Abdullah Zakir in 1754. And it's a lovely typeface which he cut himself without much training and without many guides. What about the first book printed under Islamic auspices? Well, Ibrahim Muteferrika in the 1720s in Istanbul petitioned the Ottoman Sultan with a treatise entitled the Utility of Printing, and he proposed that Ottoman Turkey was falling behind the West because of the paucity of dissemination of scientific works, because manuscripts were the only means of production then. So the Ottoman Sultan accepted, and after asking the chief mufti's idea, what he thought of it, and the mufti was happy to go ahead with it if it meant wide dissemination of knowledge and no errors creeping in. So they appointed 4 Qadis as proofreaders. And in 1729, the first book rolled off the presses. It was an Arabic-Turkish dictionary. And then this is the second book that rolled off the presses, which is a history of the naval campaigns of the Ottoman Empire by, I think, Haji Khalifa, the famous historian and scholar. And it contains these engravings by Muteferrika himself here of the globe, including the New World, and later on he printed a book about the West Indies, or the New World, and they were very successful, but the press fizzled out later on. Turning to Persian, the first Persian book was printed in India, and this is again a dictionary. It's a Persian dictionary called Burhan-i, and it was printed under the auspices of the colonial powers, but it's letterpress Persian, and it's not a Nastaliq script, which is more suited to lithography, which is the next example here, which was printed in Iran in the late 19th century. But printing came to India and Iran in about 1817, I think. At least Arabic script printing. I think the first book printed in Iran was in the 17th century, which was an Armenian book. So the Persian style of script is a lot more cursive than the Arabic, and it's more suited to lithography because the calligrapher can write it on the stone and then it's just printed off. And this is a copy of the Qur'an with Persian commentary in the margins, as I said, late 19th century, but the first book was about 1817, I think, and again it was a copy of the Qur'an. We have another, well, turning to Britain, actually, this is the British section. We'll start with Scotland. So this miniature Qur'an is a lithographed Qur'an printed by David Bryce, the famous art printer in the 1890s, and it is a scaled down imprint of an Ottoman lithographed Qur'an dated 1872, and it is said that these were issued to Muslim troops fighting for the British in the war, but somebody told me that they may have been carried by Ottoman and British troops. The first Arabic book printed in Britain was in 1642, and by John Selden, whose collections we have here, and the famous, most learned man of England at the time. He made this Arabic edition and Latin translation and commentary on the origins of the Alexandrian Church by Eutichius, the Patriarch of Alexandria, and apparently he sourced his type from Leiden, which the university there had had a press since the 1630s, I think. And then the first Arabic book printed in Oxford was 1650 by Edward Pocock. This is part of Bar Hebraeus's history, to do with the history of the Arabs before Islam. And Pocock has a facing page Latin translation and Arabic edition of that. Again, the type may have been sourced from Leiden or the Netherlands. And then jumping ahead a bit, we have a new addition to the Oxford Biblio Press. So this Arabic type was disposed of by the university press in the 1970s, but by some means it has now returned, and Alex Franklin knows more about this than I do, how it got here, but it has been returned to Oxford, and we have it at the Biblio Press only in the last month or so, and we managed to find the book that it was used on, and that is this here, which is an edition of early Arabic poetry, the Mufaddaliyat, which is a compilation, one of the earliest compilations. Al-Mufaddal, the author, died in 780 something, and he was a transmitter of ancient poetry from about 500 to 650, so mostly pre-Islamic poetry. And Charles Lyell, the Indian civil servant who had connections to Oxford, printed it in 1918 at the Clarendon Press using this type, at least for the introduction. He says that the main text was printed in Beirut, but in the introduction we've been able to find the exact type that is used by the press. And we have an example from the press here, from the time, a sort of proof, and we have the form with the type in it, but it is pied, and that's a new word which means muddled up, so it's going to require some work to reset it, but hopefully we'll do that. And there are plans to use this type to perhaps print a psalm next year. There's a project to do that coming up. So I don't know if I've gone over my 10 minutes, but any questions, let me know, and feel free to have a look. Thank you.